Hi all, and welcome to another Programming the Net tutorial. In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into CSS, and we're going to look at a few properties that we haven't discussed yet. We're going to start by talking about the position attribute, which is helpful in sort of giving us more control over where elements should be on a page. We're going to learn how to make gradients. We're going to look at CSS transforms, which give us more granularity in changing the position, scale, or rotation of an element. We're going to look at opacity. And last but not least, we're going to learn how to use Google fonts or even our own fonts in CSS. And this marks the last technical tutorial that's going to focus exclusively on HTML or CSS. Starting with the next video, we're going to start getting into JavaScript. And while we'll keep introducing some new HTML and CSS notions along the way as we study JavaScript, consider that for the most part, we know most of what we need to know in terms of HTML and CSS. So you should be able to create pretty complex web pages and compositions by now. So I have an empty glitch project in front of me. As usual, I've removed the unnecessary files. I've left index.html and style.css in here. I have the style sheet included from my head, and my style should be empty. I was doing some tests earlier. Right, so the style is empty. We have index.html. And we're going to start by talking about the CSS position attributes. And this is, as I was mentioning earlier, this is something that allows us a little bit more control in placing certain elements on the page or within other elements in kind of breaking the regular HTML structure. As we've seen so far, HTML likes to have its blocks flowing from top to bottom, or if we use display flex, kind of from left to right, but it's all very ordered, right? It's very different from working in an image editing software, right? Working in Photoshop, for example, where you can like really place every element on the screen wherever you want it and just like move with the mouse, drag it somewhere and give it some coordinates and place it there. HTML, in what we've seen so far, doesn't fully allow you to do that. And I think that's a good thing overall, because this structure of top to bottom and left to right makes the code organized, makes websites work on different screen sizes, makes websites work on mobile devices. So it's a way more scalable system. However, sometimes we do need that kind of granularity that an image editing software gives us. And that's what we're going to look at right now. So I'm going to start by creating one large container for our entire page. So I'm just going to say div class equals container, and I'm going to make it as wide as the body and super tall. So we'll just move to the CSS file, type dot container, container. I'm gonna give it a background color just so we can see it. Let's say light pink. Is that a thing? Totally a thing. Let me close this for now because it's making my computer be slow. All right, background color light pink. Let's give it a width of 100% of the body width, and let's give it a height of, I don't know, like 4,000 pixels, something super tall. Right, so we have our super long container, and it's completely scrollable as well. All right, so inside of this container, let's add 3 other divs. And I'm going to give them 3 different classes, and we will see why in a second. I'm going to say div class equals, just say rectangle 1, and then I'll do rectangle 2 and rectangle 3. Rectangle 3, oops, and rectangle 2. Let's style those as well instead of the CSS. For now, let's just give them a width, a height, and background color so we can see them. So we'll say dot rectangle 1 width. Let's just make all of them like 200 pixels wide, and height, let's say 100 pixels. And background color blue. Okay, so we see the first one showing up. We should see the second one showing up in a second. I'm gonna make this one green. And let's add the third one. Change its background color to yellow. All right, so we have three rectangles stacked on top of each other. Nothing surprising so far. And yeah, let's get into the position attribute that I was mentioning. The default behavior for all of these divs, which is the regular HTML behavior, is position relative. Having position relative won't change anything right now, and this just means like do the page layout in the regular way that HTML does it. If we wanted to have these elements get like a fixed position on the page, if we wanted it to always be in the top right corner of the page, we could use position fixed. We see that one of the rectangles disappeared, and you'll see in a second why. The one we're changing right now is the green one, rectangle 2. And with position fixed, we can give it a top, left, right, or bottom attributes as well. So if we said top 0 pixels and right 0 pixels, we would see our rectangle moved to the top right side of the page. And even when we scroll, it stays there, right? So this is, maybe you see on certain web pages in the bottom right corner, there's like a dialog for asking for help or something like that, which like stays there no matter where you scroll within the page. That's done using position fixed, right? So position fixed places an element based on the entire page, or rather based on the screen and the entire page, right? So if we were to open this in a new window, it would be in the top right of the screen, and it just stays there. And we can totally change the top right attributes, right? So if we gave it top 20 pixels, it would move down a little bit. If we gave it right, say like minus 30 pixels, you can do minus as well. It would move 30 pixels outside of the page. And we can also do bottom instead of top, right? So in that case, it would be placed at the bottom of the page, or left instead of right, and then it should be in the left side of the page. What we can also do is work with percentages instead of pixels. So if we said bottom, I don't know, like 40%, it would be roughly 40% up from the bottom, and left if we gave it 50%. It wouldn't be centered on the page because the measurement of the div starts from the top left corner, right? So its beginning would be at the very center of the page. But for now, I'm just going to keep it in the bottom left corner and say 0 and 0. All right, so this is position fixed. The next one we're going to talk about is position absolute, which is very similar to fixed. However, it relates to the parent of the element that it's being applied to, as opposed to the screen. Right, so let's see that in practice. Let's take the blue rectangle and give it the position absolute property. Position absolute. And we see the yellow rectangle again disappeared from the hierarchy. Let's give it the top and right properties as well. So we can say top 0, right 0. And we see it went to the top right corner of the screen. The behavior I was expecting was for it to go in the top right corner of our pink rectangle, not the screen itself. And I think that happened because we need to specify position relative on its parent. Yeah, so in order for position absolute to work properly for an element, we need to give its parent position relative. And then if we say top 20 pixels, right 0, it should, maybe 40. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, it's just taking a while to update. And I wasn't scrolled all the way to the top. Yeah, so we should be able to place an element at a very specific position inside of its parent, right? So if at this point I change the width of the container to say 50%, that would it would affect the blue rectangle in the sense that it would still be at yeah 60% from the top and right and 0 from the right within its parent within the container, right? And this is different from position fixed, in that position fixed operates within the space of the entire screen, and position absolute operates within the space of the container of this element. I'm going to bring this back to 100%. Yeah, and don't, whenever you use position absolute, don't forget to have position relative on the parent, because otherwise I think CSS would just go up the hierarchy until it finds one element with position relative. I think that's it in terms of the position. So relative, absolute, and fixed, and don't forget about the top, right, bottom, and left properties when working with this. Yeah, let's do one more thing that's like sort of related to the position. In the previous tutorial, we talked about how we can center elements using display flex, right? Center them horizontally and vertically. That's most of the times the preferred position, the preferred way of doing centering. However, there is another way that uses position absolute, right? So let's say we wanted to center this blue rectangle inside of the whole container, the pink rectangle. For that reason, I'm going to make the pink rectangle a little bit less tall. I'm just going to make it 1,000 pixels. Let's make it even less. Let's make it 500. Let's make it fit within the screen, and let's try to center the blue rectangle inside of it. We could say top 50% and right 50%. Or rather, let's say left 50%. Right, and we see this is centering the top left corner of our blue rectangle. However, we want the center of our rectangle to be aligned with the center of the container. And the way to do that is by using the CSS transform property. Transforms allow us to apply translation, which means moving, rotation, or scale to individual HTML elements, right? So in here, if we were able to move this blue rectangle by half of its height up and by half of its width to the left, then it would move its center all the way to the top left, the current top left corner. So for that, we would say translate x minus 50%, and this 50% is based on the dimension of the rectangle, so of the element that the transform is being applied to, and then translate y minus 50%. Oh, I think there is no comma in between them, actually. There we go. Right, so we're applying two transforms to it, a translation on the x-axis by 50% of it, by minus 50, or like by 50% to the left, and then a translation on the y-axis by 50% of its height all the way to the top. Right, if we translate it by 50% instead of minus 50, it would move down instead of moving up. And the same thing for the x-axis. If we had 50% instead of minus 50, it would move to the right instead of moving to the left. The other thing to know about the translations is that you can use pixels instead of percentages, right? So we can say 50 pixels instead of 50%, right? And that would be, yeah, just moving it by 50 pixels. Our width is 100, our width is 200 pixels, right? So if we translate it by 100, that would be the equivalent of doing 50%. But for the purpose of centering, I usually work with percentages just because I don't have to worry about how much the width and the height are at the moment. yeah, so that's it with the translation. Again, for centering stuff, I usually recommend display flex, but sometimes that doesn't work, and then you can use this trick. Um, the other two things that transform can do are rotation. So if we say rotate 45 deg, deg stands for degree, right? So it just rotates our element by 45 degrees. Of course, you can plug in any angle in there, and it's just going to work. Uh, yeah, I think that's enough for the rotation. Let's leave it at 45. I like how that looks. And then you can also do scale. And I don't remember if scale takes a different scale X and scale Y or just scale, so I'm just going to try out both of them. So let's say scale 2. Yeah, so this blew up our element and made it larger within the composition, right? Like it doesn't work in percentages, I think. It works on a scale from 0 to 1, where 1 is its usual size. Anything under 1 is where it should be small. Yeah, there we go. Anything under 1 is smaller, and anything over 1 is larger. Yeah, and I think this, the transform property with the translate, rotate, and scale can be really powerful in just fine-tuning your elements, especially if you're creating more graphical compositions with HTML. They can prove really, really handy in achieving the look that you want. Um, yeah, I'll leave it there for the transforms, and let's take a look at how we could create gradients. We saw Rafael Rosendal's work last week, and so much of what he does is gradients on the web, and they're quite easy to make and also a lot of fun. So in order to apply a gradient to a div, it works in a very similar way to the background color, right? But instead of having a solid color, we would use a gradient. And the property to use for that is the background image property. So we have background image. And then CSS allows us to do two types of gradients. There's linear gradients and radial gradients. Linear gradients go from left to right or from top to bottom in whatever direction we tell them. And radial gradients go from the center of the div towards the outside in kind of circle increments. So I'm going to start with the linear gradient. So I'm just going to say linear gradient from blue to black. Right, so we see our gradient over here, where all the way to the top of it, like the top right, is full blue, all the way to the bottom left is full black, and everything in between is like a smooth change between the blue and the black. We can add multiple colors, so we can, if we say blue, purple, black, we would have a gradient with sort of 3 stops. You can do as many as you want, right? And the other thing to know about the gradient is that we can specify a direction for it. For now, I'm going to actually remove the rotation of our element just to make it easy for us to understand the rotation for the direction for the gradient. So the default is a 0 degree, no, maybe not. The default might be 180 degrees. So this is an angle, right? It's the angle of the gradient onto our element. So if we say, let's say 90 degrees, once the page loads, our gradient is going to go from left to right, right? So blue, purple, black, pink. Let's do light pink so it blends into the page. And maybe let's also start with light pink. Light pink. Yeah, so that's 90 degrees. You can also do it sort of like sideways, right? Like 120 degrees, where it starts more in the corner. I'm going to keep it at 90 for now. Yeah, and the other thing that's super cool that you can do with the gradients is you can sort of specify where on your where on your object you want each one of the color stops to be. So if we say light pink 30%, that's going to move our light pink stop and make it cover the first third of our gradient, right? So I'm going to make it actually 10%. Let's say blue is at 20%, purple is at 30%, right? So these percentages are percentage of the width of the element or percentage of the direction in which the gradient is going, right? If black is at 35%, it's going to be super narrow, and then most of the rest of it is going to be light pink, up to 100%. Yeah, so that's it with percentages. And then if we rotate the gradient, if we make it 45 degrees, it's going to change the direction, right? And the color stops are going to follow that as well. Let's spread it out a little bit. 40. You see now it has some hard stops because the percentages are not incrementing. So I'm going to fix that. Let's take 60 and black, I don't know, 75. All right. Great. The other thing you can do, gradients, as you see, are super powerful within CSS. Like you can do this kind of stuff. I think there's also more properties and more granularity that you can get into when using them. If you Google CSS linear gradient and go to the official documentation on the Mozilla developer webpage, you can see a bunch of examples of what can be done with the gradients, and also kind of all the different types of properties that they take. I recommend that you check this out. Before we move on to the radial gradient, I wanted to show one other thing which is applicable to background colors as well, and to any other things. Instead of specifying the named color as we've learned, or a hex color, we can also tell CSS the red, green, and blue components in numbers for the colors. And that can be done using the RGBA function, right? So if we say 255 for red, 128 for green, 12 for blue, and 1 for alpha, we're going to get this orange. So what do these numbers mean? The first one is the red component, the second one is the green component, the third one is the blue component, right? These go from 0 to 255, and it's the same color representation that we've talked about in a previous tutorial. The fourth number goes from 0 to 1 and represents the alpha of the color, which means the transparency. So if instead of giving it a 1, we gave it a 0.1, we see that our color mostly disappears. Let's give it a 0.5. So now we see kind of a blend, and the blend is between the orange and I think the background color, which is blue. So if I were to make this background color white, right, our orange corner would change into kind of like a washed out orange. So if we made it 0.1, it's mostly white with a little bit of orange. 0.8 is mostly orange, and 1 is the full color. Yeah, so this is just good to keep in mind that there is another way of representing colors in CSS, and also of giving them a transparency if you want to work with that. Great. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop here for the linear gradient. Let's also take a look at the radial gradient. And I think that one is going to be way quicker since it's very similar to the linear one. I'm going to change the yellow rectangle here. I'm going to actually remove the background color and just do background image radial gradient. Let's say from pink to orange. Right, so it's quite subtle, so maybe I'll change that pink in the middle to green. right? So you see the very center is completely green, the corners are orange, and yeah, it grows on a radius in a circle as opposed to going from left to right. I think you can also specify percentages in here. So if we said green 10%, orange 25%, we would get a lot more orange. Right, so 75% is more like everything after 75% is pure orange, everything before that is a blend. I'm gonna make it maybe 85. And again, look up the documentation for the radial gradient on the CSS, on the Mozilla developer documentation. Let's see if it's here at the radial gradient. And you can see, yeah, various other ways that it can be used and various other things that can be made with it. The other really cool thing that you can do with gradients is use an online tool. The one that I found is cssgradient.io, but if you just Google CSS gradient generator, there might be other ones too, which sort of gives you a visual interface for creating gradients, right? So you have a few, by default, a few sliders on a wheel that you can adjust of like where you want the color stops to be. You can change each one of the colors by selecting the stop on the slider and changing its color. You can change its transparency. You can add other stops by clicking on this bar and manipulating it in this sort of in the same way that you do with any other ones. You can change the angle, or you can select between the linear and the radial gradient, and it just generates the CSS code for you, right? So if we copy this, just hit copy to clipboard, this, and paste it into our CSS, we should just see the new gradient that we just created, right? And notice they're using the background property instead of the background image property. You can do that too. They're sort of interchangeable. Background sort of works as a catch-all for background color and background image. All right, that's it for the gradients. The one other thing that I wanted to show for the background image attribute is the fact that besides making gradients with it, you can also add images with it, right? It's called background image, so maybe you've thought about that. You've thought about that already. And I'm going to add an image to the background of the div in the green one. But first I'm going to move it up a little bit. So let's say bottom 50 pixels, and left also 50, just so we can see it. And maybe I'll make it a little bit taller as well. I'm going to remove the background color again and add the background image. And the way to add an image to the background of the div is by typing URL, open and close parentheses, the quotation marks inside of it, and pasting a link to an image. I have this image right here, which I'm going to paste. Right, so we see the image showing up as the background of the div, right? And this is very similar to using the img attribute for the images. It's just a different way of bringing an image into a web page. I tend to use the img tag more often than the background image, but you can use whichever you want. So what do we see? We see that our image was cropped, right? So the original looks like this, and we're just getting the top 200 pixels wide and tall square from within this image. And there are a few ways of controlling how the image gets displayed within its container. In order to do that, I'm going to go through the CSS inspector because I always forget the names of the attributes for the properties. So we have background image, and the first other property we're going to look at is background position. So background position can be bottom, center, left, revert, right, top, or unset. What these do is, or like what this property does is telling HTML which part of the image to display within the container, right? So if we say center, that's going to display the 200 by 200 square, which is right at the very center of the image, right? Same for top or left or so on. So this is useful in just like positioning your image within the container. However, we're still not getting the full image, right? Like maybe we want it to scale down and fit the size of this square. And the way to do that is by using the background size property. And the ones that matter here are contain and cover. And what these do, they're very similar to each other. I think contain will make the image fit on the width, I think, and cover will make it fit on the height or something like that. I'm not fully sure what the difference is between them. Let's change the width and see how it behaves. Oh, I see. So contain seems to tile the image if the width is larger than the width of the image. Let's change the height and see what happens. Okay, so now we're getting to the full image, and then yeah, if the height gets even higher, then the image is going to be repeated within the container. So let's go back to 100 pixels, and if we choose cover, what happens in this case is that we get a zoom in on the image based on our background position, right? So in this case, zoom in on the center, and yeah, the image would never tile. So if we made the height taller, you see how it scales, and it's just the center of the image sort of getting larger or like getting more and more pixels towards the edges. And the moment we pass the aspect ratio of the image, it starts zooming in on the other dimension. So this background size cover is useful, for example, if you have a section on a website that's as wide as the entire page and maybe 100 pixels tall or 200 pixels tall, where you want the background image with some text on top. Using background image with the background size cover will make it work well on sort of all screen dimensions. Maybe we can show that. So let's make this div be 100% wide. Oh, I see its position. Oh yeah, there we go. 100% wide, and yeah, 200 tall is fine. And then let's have it at 0, 0, bottom and left. Background size cover to our CSS because we just changed it in the browser. Right, so now when we go back to the page, whenever we resize, our image is going to be like we're going to see a portion of the image, and the image is not going to stretch or do any strange things, but rather just zoom in and zoom out based on the attributes we've given it. Right, if we wanted to see the center of the image, we would just say background position center. Right, and that would give us the center of our image. And if we scroll it super narrow, we would see the entire image. Yeah, I think that's it for the background image. Again, super powerful property, can be used for gradients, for linear and radial gradients, and for bringing in images. We're going to talk about a few more very short things. There's one property that I haven't mentioned so far, but I use it super often and it's really easy to remember. And this is the opacity property. It's super straightforward. Opacity, if you give it a 1, that's sort of the default, and it means that an element is fully opaque, so it's visible. If you give it a 0, the element is fully transparent, and anything between 0 and 1 is going to be its level of transparency, right? So this is how you can achieve transparency within CSS. Again, really easy to remember and super simple to use and super helpful. And now there are two other types of CSS selectors that I want to talk to you about. And these are a little bit, let's change this back to opacity 1. These are a little different from the previous ones that we've used in the sense that they don't select elements from our HTML, but rather select for different states of one element. And I'm talking here about the hover state, so whenever the mouse is on top of an element, and the click state, whenever an element is being clicked. And these are very helpful in starting to think about interactivity on our web pages, right? Like what we want to happen when a user hovers over a certain portion of our website or when a user clicks somewhere. We're going to get significantly more into interactivity as we start learning JavaScript, as JavaScript is sort of the main mechanism for creating interaction on the web. However, CSS can be very helpful in doing a few simple things. So let's say that we wanted the rectangle in the middle of our page, our gradient, to become semi-transparent whenever the user hovers on top of it. That was rectangle 3, I believe. No, the rectangle 3 is the one at the top. It's probably, yeah, rectangle 1. Yeah, let's make it be slightly transparent when the user hovers. In order to do that, I'm going to add it a opacity of 1 to begin with. Nothing should change right now. And the way to select for when the element is hovered is by typing dot rectangle 1, right? So the plus that we have, and then colon hover. Right? And inside of this declaration, we can write some different CSS that we want the element to get whenever it's being hovered. So in our case, it's going to be opacity 0.25. All right, so if we did everything right now, the moment my mouse goes over it, the element becomes transparent. We can also change other properties, right? We can change the top to be 0, right? So in that case, the element would move whenever being hovered, which is kind of a fun and silly interaction. We can change the gradient that's being shown. I'm just going to create a super simple one from white to black. Right, so whenever we hover, it becomes something completely different. I'm going to remove the opacity for now. Right, so any CSS is on the table for whenever it's hovered. And the other interaction selector that I wanted to show you is the one for clicking, which works in a very similar way with the hovering one. It's called active, so we'll type rectangle 1 colon active. And in this case, let's change the gradient yet again to, I don't know, red, yellow, green, and change the angle as well. Right, so whenever we hover, we get one gradient. If I click, we get another gradient. It's hard for you to hear my click probably, but right now I'm clicking. Right, and the active one doesn't need the hover one to be there, right? Like I can just remove the hover, nothing is going to happen when I hover, and the click one is still going to be there. Yeah, let me bring back the hover one. Yeah, so think about these two as a very small introduction to user interaction, and we're going to get more into that as we start talking about JavaScript. And the very last thing that I wanted to talk to you about in this video is using custom fonts for your text. So far we've only been using the HTML default fonts, right? So serif, sans serif, and monospace. They make it really easy to bring in your own fonts and use them. Today I'm going to show how to use Google Fonts. If you go to fonts.google.com, you'll see a pretty large selection of typefaces. These are all free to use, which is great, and they are really easy to integrate into a website. So let's say I wanted to use the .gothic 16. I just have to click on it, and under styles, just hit select this style. Oh, interesting. Maybe download family. No, not download family. Oh yeah, there we go. You have to click the show your selected families or hide your selected families if this dialog doesn't show up automatically. And if you scroll down a bit, it says use on the web, and in here we have a little piece of code that we need to add into our HTML. So we see it's the link tag, the same one that we're using for our style sheets, and there's two of them that we need to paste in the head of our HTML. So I'm going to copy them and paste them inside of our head. Okay, and I think one of them is just making the connection to Google Fonts, and the second one is actually downloading or like bringing the specific font that we want inside of our page. Right, so nothing happens yet because we haven't specified the font family property on our page. It's just that the font is being downloaded into our page. And in order to specify the font family, they also tell us how to do that. Right, so we just copy. Oh, I think I had the second. I think I had the second font selected, which is why we're getting two font families. You might just see one, which is totally fine. So we'll just copy this font family .gothic 16 and bring it into our CSS. Let's add it to the container. And we don't have any text yet. So let's add some text to the container. Right, so you see the text showing up in our font. It looks a little strange and maybe a little bit different from what we see here, because H1 is making fonts bold by default. However, we don't have a bold version of this font, so it's just kind of enlarging the letters. So we can just say font weight normal. And that might or might not fix it. Looks like it didn't fix it. Then maybe we can simply remove the H1 and leave it as a paragraph. Paragraph. All right. And one thing to note over here is the fact that we have our font family declaration, very similar to what we've seen before. However, it has two elements, right? It has .gothic 16 followed by a comma and then followed by sans serif. This is serving, the sans serif part is serving as a backup, right? Like in case for any reason the font can't be downloaded, or if it's misspelled, then CSS will realize, oh, I cannot find the font called .gothic 14, so I'm going to go on to the next typeface, the next font that's declared in here, which is sans serif. And that's pretty much what there is to know about bringing in Google Fonts into your site. If you wanted to bring your own font into the site, you'd have to upload it inside of the assets directory and do a similar declaration within the head of your HTML. Feel free to reach out if you want to do that, and I can write an example for you if this doesn't work. yeah, I think I'm going to stop here for now. This is a lot of CSS, and I'm hoping you'll have fun with it for the next assignment. As usual, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you so much.